The United States and Israel, the two major rogue states in the world. I mean, there's a reason why in international polls run by U.S. polling agencies, the main ones, the United States is regarded as the greatest threat to world peace by an overwhelming margin. No other country's even close. Incidentally, it's kind of interesting that the U.S. media refused to publish this, but it doesn't go away.
Well, you don't hold the US President Barack Obama in very high esteem, but does this still make you think of him in slightly better terms? The fact that he is trying to reduce the threat of a nuclear war.
Actually, he isn't. He's just initiated a program, a $1 trillion program of modernization of the nuclear weapon system, which means expanding the nuclear weapon system. That's one of the reasons why the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of American Scientists has just a couple of weeks ago been pushed 2 minutes closer to midnight. Midnight is the end. It's now 3 minutes from midnight. That's the closest it's been in 30 years, since the early Reagan years when there was a major war scare.
Well, you mentioned, obviously, the US and Israel in terms of Iran. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu obviously doesn't want this nuclear deal to work at all, and he says...
And it's interesting. We should ask why.
Why?
We know why. Iran has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region, let alone the United States. Its strategic doctrine is defensive. It's designed to hold off an attack long enough for diplomacy to set in. And the United States and Israel, the two rogue states, do not want to tolerate a deterrent. No strategic analyst with a brain functioning thinks that Iran could ever use a nuclear weapon. If it even prepared to do so, the country would simply be vaporized. And there's no indication that the ruling clerics, whatever you think about them, want to see everything they have destroyed.
Just one more question now on this issue, and this is from another member of our social media, and it's Morton A. Anderson, and he asks, do you believe that the US would ever strike a deal that would be dangerous to Israel in the first place?
The United States is carrying out constant actions which endanger Israel very seriously, namely supporting Israeli policy. For the last 40 years, the greatest threat to Israel has been its own policies. If you look back 40 years, say 1970, Israel was one of the most admired countries in the world, respected, admired, lots of favorable attitudes towards it. Now it's one of the most disliked and feared countries in the world. In the early 70s, Israel made a decision. They had a choice. They made a decision to prefer expansion to security. And that carries with it dangerous consequences. The consequences which were obvious at the time, I wrote about them, other people did. If you prefer expansion to security, it is going to lead to internal degeneration, anger, opposition, isolation, and possibly ultimate destruction. And by supporting those policies, the United States is contributing to the threats that Israel faces.
Well, then you see, that will bring me to the point of terrorism then, because that is really a global blight. And, you know, some, and I think including yourself, will say that this is blowback for US terrorist policy around the world. How far is the US and its allies responsible for what we're seeing now in terms of the terrorist attacks around the world?
Remember, the worst terrorist campaign in the world right now, by far, is the one that's being orchestrated in Washington. That's the global assassination campaign. There's never been a terrorist campaign at that scale.
When you say global assassination campaign...
The drone campaign. That's exactly what it is. Over large parts of the world, the United States is systematically, publicly, openly, I'm just nothing secret about what I'm saying. We all know it. It's carrying out regular campaigns to assassinate people who the U.S. government suspects of intending to harm us someday. And indeed, it is, as you mentioned, a terror-generating campaign. When you bomb a village in Yemen, say, and you kill somebody, maybe the person you were aiming at, maybe not, and other people who were happen to be in the neighborhood, how do you think people react? They say, we're going to take revenge.
You describe the US as the leading terrorist state. Where does Europe fit into that picture then?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, for example, there was recently a study, I think it was done by the Open Society Forum, of the worst form of torture, rendition. Rendition means you take somebody you suspect of something and you send him off to your favorite dictator, maybe Assad or Gaddafi or Mubarak, to be tortured, and then hoping that maybe something will come out of it. That's extraordinary rendition. The study reviewed the countries that participated in it. Well, obviously the Middle East dictatorships, because that's where they were sent to be tortured. Europe, most of Europe participated. England, Sweden, other countries. In fact, there was only one region of the world where nobody participated, Latin America, which is very dramatic. First of all, Latin America has now gotten pretty much out of U.S. control. When it was controlled by the United States not very long ago, it was the world center of torture. Now it wouldn't participate in the worst form of torture, rendition. Europe participated. If the master roars, the servants cower.
So Europe is the servant of the United States?
Evidently. They're too cowardly to take an independent position.
Where does Vladimir Putin fit into this picture? He's painted as, well, one of the greatest global threats to security. Is he?
Like most leaders, he's a threat to his own population. He's taken illegal actions, obviously, but to depict him as a crazed monster who's suffering from brain disease and has Alzheimer and is, a rat-faced evil creature, that's standard Orwellian fanaticism. I mean, whatever you think about his policies, they're understandable. The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.